Hello lovely people, I'm K3N and in this video I'm going to show you how I knit my Scrappy socks. Now, a few things to say. There are a bazillion different ways to make socks, you know, and I've tried quite a lot of them over the years. And there's a bazillion different kinds of heel, ways to cast off, you know, you can go up or down, you can do two at a time, one at a time, whatever. This is just to show you how I do it, because when I did my sock darning video, some people asked me. So I'm not saying this is the way, this is the way that I enjoy doing it. So I'm just going to share that with you. Before I get into the actual socks, there's just a few things I wanted to show you up front that I've found useful in general with Scrappy wool especially, is to wind it into these little balls, which have a centre pull. So you can get the wool off the outside, not in the normal way, and you can also pull it from the inside. Do you see? So I'm just going to show you how to quickly, how to wind that, in case you didn't know. Now, traditionally one uses a nostepinner, which is a Scandinavian word meaning nest stick, but I use this, which is actually a pern or a pern. It's a Scottish word. Just getting a bit of wool to wind, this will do. I'll just move that out of the way. But basically you need something, a stick, and that's smooth so it doesn't snag your yarn or anything like that. I'm not going to do a whole one because it'll take ages, just so you get the idea. So I get hold of the tail of the yarn with my hand down there like that, and anchor it with my thumb, because you don't want that tail getting trapped in the middle. And then I come up here, you know, to the top of the stick, the nostepinner. And with my index finger I hold that so it doesn't go anywhere, that strand that's coming to the ball that I want to wind. Is it all in frame? Yeah. Let me just move that a minute because you might be trying to read it and be distracted. And then I make myself a little base to begin with of about 1 inch, like that. And I try not to wind too tightly. And then once I've got a little base to wind, then basically you start going at a 45-degree angle, and as you wind you turn. Do you see I'm turning it with my left hand? And that's a bit of pain because it's catching. And I keep my index finger there to stop the strand sliding down. And it might feel a little bit like scratching your head and rubbing your tummy in the beginning, but you know, with practice you'll get better at it. You can also get those machines, you know, those, what they're called, that you put the wool round, and then you have another machine where you turn a handle and it winds it. I just like simple rustic things, so, you know, I do it like this. So if I ever buy yarn in a hank, then this is what I do. I have the hank round my knees, my feet up on the coffee table, and I wind. And after a while you find you don't really need to keep your finger there anymore. It doesn't slide off once you get some substance to it. And so you just keep going until all your wool's wound. And if you find you jump too far, you can just come back and fill in. And I just find it a very therapeutic, mindful task to do. And then you end up with a lovely pile of nuggets of yarns that you can use easily and they don't get all tangled. So that's that, quickly. When I get to the end, I just put my finger in the way, wrap it round and trap the tail underneath. You know, obviously I haven't wound this whole thing. And then you just ease it off the end. And then you've got the tail coming from the middle of the ball. And then you'll have the other tail coming from that end. So sometimes if I'm knitting socks 2 at a time, as I've got here a pair that I'm making for my mum at the moment, I will then knit from either end of the same ball. Do you see? Do you see? So one of my strands is coming from around the outside of the ball. If I can unwind what I've wound off. Do you see one strand's coming from the outside of the ball to one sock, and the other strand's coming from the inside of the ball to the other sock. And I find that way I don't get tangled as much as if I had 2 separate balls of wool. Now these socks for my mum, I'm making, this is my general go-to for making, you know, socks with sock yarn type thickness, which is 4-ply in the UK, and in the US they call it fingering, or sock, you know, sock yarn. These are 2mm and it's a US size 0. That's for my tension. Obviously that won't be the same for everybody. You would have to, if you didn't know, knit a tension swatch or a gauge swatch before you start. Because the important thing with socks that they wear well is that you have quite a firm fabric, so you can't really go by what it says on the ball band, you know, it recommends what needle size. It's probably a size smaller. And the other thing is that with socks, they have to fit your feet, because if they don't, well, number one, they're not comfortable to wear, but number two, if they're too loose, then they'll, you know, move about inside your shoes or whatever, and they'll wear through more quickly. And if they're too tight, then the yarn's pulled super thin, and then they'll wear more quickly. So for socks, I'm afraid, I'm sorry, I know knitters hate knitting gauge swatches and tension swatches on the whole, but you just kind of have to. But you'll only have to do it once, because after that you'll know, you know, you'll get to know how many stitches you need for your sock, and then you won't ever have to knit a gauge swatch again. Having said that, in order to show you how I knit socks, I'm not going to do these because it takes, you know, quite a long time. I'm going to use bigger needles. So here I've got these are 4mm, which is a US size 6, I believe, it's written on the packet. And I use these. I use Chowgu, red, what are they called? Twist, lace interchangeables, lace tips. Chowgu Twist. I've bought many needles over the years, you know, cheap ones getting gradually more expensive. These are very expensive, but I've had them for a very long time. What I love about these is that the cable does not kink. Doesn't matter what you do with it, you know, within reason. It doesn't kink. There's steel inside it. It's covered in plastic, you know. So I've got many different ones. I have the interchangeable, so you can take the tips off and put a different tip on. The cable that I like to use for socks is 30 inches long, or 75 centimetres. Some people like a longer cable, but I find that's long enough for me. And the tips are 13 centimetres long, because you can get different length tips as well. Just be aware, if you do go down the interchangeables route, if you're buying needles, that the little tools and things for changing them are quite fiddly. So you've got this sticky thing and a little hole here that you have to stick it in. You know, it's quite fiddly. So if you have trouble with your hands, it maybe not the best way to get interchangeables. Maybe get the fixed ones. So I'm going to make, so that's Chowgu's. I'm going to make some socks, some sort of chunky house socks, so they wouldn't be socks that I'd necessarily wear inside shoes or anything. So I wanted to use double knit yarn, but I haven't got any double knit, or not any significant amount. So that's why I've got this, which is fingering weight, sock weight, and I'm going to use it double. So the first thing I'm going to do is just talk you through my whole process, which I've written down so I don't miss anything out. I've written on a bit of paper. So I knit my socks, Scrappy or otherwise, 2 at a time, which you'll see abbreviated to TAAT. I start at the toe and I go up. I use one circular needle, like I showed you. I start with Judy's Magic Cast On, but I use a variation that I learnt from the wonderful Nathan Taylor, who's known as Sockmatician. I do toe increases just using a knit front and back, very simple. When I join in a new yarn, I knit my tail in and then sew it in as I go along. I'll show you that. I do an afterthought heel with some forethought, which doesn't require any short rows, any heel turning, any picking up of stitches or anything like that. It's if you can knit an afterthought heel. I use a knit 2 together through the back of loop, stretchy cast off when I get up to the cuff, because you can't do a normal bind off or a cast off because you won't get your foot through the, you know, it won't stretch. And then when I go back to do my heel, I have a couple of little tips to modify for people that have got a very high instep, you know, if your foot at its widest point, if you go round from the heel, around the top of your foot. Some people, my husband in particular, has got that's very large on him. So there's some things I have to do to make it fit him. So I'll show you those. And then when I'm working the heel, I just do basically a toe in reverse, and I use a slip, slip, knit, knit, two together decrease. And then to graft the toe, I do a simplified version of the Kitchener stitch. And it's not difficult, you know. I used to be frightened of Kitchener stitch, nothing to fear at all. So that's a basic overview, so you can decide at this point whether you think it's interesting to follow along or you know, or not. Okay, so the first thing I have here, before I actually get some wool onto some needles, and I wanted to introduce you to my family's feet. For every member of the family, or every person that I knit for, I have a foot. And this is very handy when they're not here, you know, for trying on and so on. So one big advantage of toe up is that you can try them on as you go and be sure that they're going to fit. So here you see my husband's great big flipper. And where's my daughter? That's my mum's got very long, pointy foot. I don't know where Lily is. I don't think Lily's here. I don't know where Lily's foot is. Oh yeah, there it is, hiding. Yeah, Lily also has got a very pointy toe. Do you see the variation? It's not just the size, it's the shape. Feet are quite weird. So what you can do is get someone to help you, if you know, or draw around the foot of the person who you want to knit for. If you've never made socks before, I would recommend making some for yourself to start with. Why not? Treat yourself. And I would also recommend doing this thicker version on bigger needles to start with, because it'll go quicker, and I think if you choose the fine ones that will take you ages to make, the process won't stick in your head as well as if it happens more quickly. Do you see what I'm saying? So stand on a piece of pizza box or whatever, draw around your foot, and then mark your heel placement. Now that, for everybody in my family, is about 2 inches from the end of the foot to draw that line there. The recommended way of doing it is to take a pen and line it up with your ankle bone, but you know, just it's 2 inches. 2 inches works fine. So you need a line at 2 inches from this end. And then here I've drawn another line. Can you see? You see this line here? I'll put my pen there. And that's sort of the widest point of the foot. And then I've measured that line, and on me that's 3 3/4 inches, just along that line. Okay, I hope that's all clear so far. So I highly recommend this, and then on here you can also make notes. I put the person's name, K3N, that's mine. And I've made notes about different yarns and gauge and all that, so it's all there in one place as a reference. And even if I'm knitting for myself as I go along, I can try the sock on over the cardboard. Do you see? To see if it fits, and to see if I'm up to where I need to start worrying about the heel and things like that. The other advantage of this is socks must have something in them called negative ease, which basically means they must stretch ever so slightly. It's like when I was talking about the importance of the fabric. So if this fits nicely and flat and without stretching over this flat piece of cardboard, then by the time you put it on your foot, which has got, 3 dimensions to it, it'll stretch slightly, and that's just about the right amount. So that's another advantage of the cardboard. Okay, so I hope that's a lot of information, but luckily you can pause and rewind and all that if you want to or you need to. So gauge swatch. Yes, I know. If you don't want to knit a gauge swatch, you can just go straight into the socks, try them on your cardboard foot. If they're not right, you can pull them back and start again as many times as you need to. I'm just going to show you how I knit a gauge swatch. I'm just going to choose some wool. So I'm going to use the needles and the wool that I think I want to use for the project. So I'm going to use 2 strands of this, which equals double knit. Actually, I'm going to choose a different colour because it's not very contrasty against the... Is that too scary? No, that's okay, isn't it? So on the ball band of when you buy wool, I don't have the ball band left for this anywhere. I don't even entirely know what it is, to be honest. But often on the ball band it'll give a needle size. Usually you want to go down a size or so. But again, that's something else you'll learn with your gauge swatch. Now I cast on the way my Auntie Lily showed me, which is a very, very old-fashioned way of casting on, over my thumb. So, you know, if you want to cast on a different way, you cast on a different way. I just do it like this, over my thumb. The first is not even a stitch, it's just a twist. So then I put my thumb through the loop and I knit 2. Don't pull it too tightly. And I want a good 4 inches of knitting, or 10 centimetres, because you should always measure your gauge over a good length. You can't just knit an inch and a bit, and you know. What you're aiming for is to find out how many stitches per inch, if you don't know, if you're not an experienced knitter. Because then when you know how many stitches per inch, and you know the size of your foot, you know how many stitches you need for your sock. That makes sense. I'm basically assuming you know how to knit, but I'm not assuming anything else. So, you know, if you're an experienced knitter and you know all this, just fast forward or tune out or whatever. I'm not counting anymore. It doesn't really matter as long as I end up with a good 4 inches of... I mean, my cast on will be slightly smaller than when I start knitting, so if it looks like a good 4 inches, or if my tail runs out, whichever comes first. This is not how you cast on to make socks, by the way. That's completely different. This is purely a gauge swatch. So a quick count of those. Talk amongst yourselves while I count. I can't talk and count at the same time. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 23. Let's do 24, just because it's an even number. Right. So gauge when you're knitting flat can vary from gauge when you're knitting in the round. When you're knitting socks, you're knitting in the round. So the reason for that is usually because when you purl, which if you turn that now and you are going to do stockinette in the flat, you'd turn that and then you'd purl. Your purl stitches have a different tension to your knit stitches. I know from experience that my purl and knit are pretty close in tension because I've knit a lot of ganzes and things like that. But if you don't know that, then I'm just going to show you. What I do is when I've cast on is I knit back and forth a couple of times to give myself a garter stitch edge, because then my gauge swatch lays flat. I'm also a thrower, as you can see, and I also don't tension my yarn around my right hand in any way, shape or form, because I was taught to knit by my Auntie Lily, who had already had a stroke by the time she taught me, and she couldn't tension the yarn around her hand. And many, many needlework teachers, including the famous Mrs. Taverner over the years, have tried to make me, you know, do all that. And I just can't, so I do this. And, you know, I've been doing it for 50 plus years, and it works fine. Right, so I'm just getting to the end, and then I'll turn round, and I'll knit back the other way. And then I'll show you, if you're not sure about your tension varying between your purl and your knit, what you can do. Oops. So that extra row of garter stitch just makes the end lay flat. Right, so now I'm on a knit row, what would be a knit row. So I'm going to knit, obviously. It's a knit row. I'm not used to knitting sitting at a desk. My cable is, it's fine. And use the same needles that you're going to use, you know, the same needles that you want to use for your project, because even different brands of needle of the same size can vary. There's many, many reasons I like these Chowgoos. They're nice to hold. They have a very long tapered point, but they're not so pointy that when I do that they, you know, stab me. The cables I already talked about. I've had them for years and they don't break here. Some other types I've had the cables eventually broken where it joins the needle. So, you know, you can do nothing with those, I only throw them away. I've tried many, many different kinds. A lot of it is down to personal preference. Right, so now I want to knit again. I don't want to purl. I haven't turned anything over. I want to go back and do another knit row to check because I want to check my tension in stocking stitch or stockinette. So all I'm going to do is pull that back through, not turning anything around, so I'm ready to knit. And then I'm going to get the yarn back here, and I'm not going to pull it tight, I'm just going to leave a loop hanging. And I even put my finger in there so I can't pull it tight. And the first one's going to feel really weird because it's not attached to anything, do you see? And then I'm just going to knit. Now when you've done this gauge swatch, you can pull it back out and save the wool, so that's what I do. Technically you should wash it and block it before you check your gauge. Technically, that's up to you if you want to do that. It depends what I'm doing. If I'm doing something like a jumper, and I'm really unsure about my gauge or the wool that I'm using or whatever, I will do that properly. Wash and block my swatch before I measure. But for this, because it's only a sock, you know, what's the worst that can happen? I get a few inches up the sock, I try it on over my cardboard toe and it's not right, and so I just pull it back and start again and make an adjustment. That's a decision that I make. That first one will also come really loopy because of this, you know. And then you just keep doing that, so you just pull your stitches back, you're not turning anything around. And the first and the last stitch will be weird, but it doesn't matter. So same thing again, just get your yarn here, put a finger or two in the way so that you don't pull that wool too tight, and then just knit. And you need that yarn to be super loose at the back, because when you've knit your swatch you need to lay it down and put pins in it so that you can measure how many stitches you're getting per inch. So you just keep doing that until you've got a square that's at least 4 inches square. A piece that's at least 4 inches square. So I won't make you watch me do that because that would be super boring. So I'll go and do that, and I'll come back and show you how I measure gauge, and then we can get a sock cast on finally. Okay, so here's my gauge swatch. Full disclosure, I should have made it wider. My tail ran out, I was lazy, because the received wisdom is that you count your gauge over a 4-inch square, so you see how many stitches you get per 4 inches, and then you divide by 4, and that's your stitches per inch. Because your tension might vary a little bit here and there, so if you just pick a random inch somewhere in your knitting and count those stitches, it might not be super accurate. Just depends how accurate you want to be. So anyway, I've gone for 3 inches. So what I've done is I've pinned my poor little gauge swatch out. I haven't stretched it or anything, it's just laying naturally. And then I've put 2 pins in the lines of knitting. Now a knit stitch, if you don't know, forms a column of little V's like this. So each little V is a knit stitch. So what I've done is I've measured 3 inches with my ruler between from the outside edge of 2 columns of knitting. It can be also half a stitch, and then you can, you know, measure accurately. Mine happens to be a full stitch by luck. So between 3 inches where my fingers are, I've marked a pin in the centre of that column, and then I've counted how many stitches there are, and there are 18 by luck, because that's an easy sum. 3 into 18 goes 6. So my stitch gauge with these needles and this yarn is 6 stitches per inch. You could also at this point, if you wanted to, check your row gauge, although I don't really bother with socks because, you know, you measure as you go and so on. So my gauge is 6 stitches per inch. The tension square has done its work. I shall get it away. I shall pull it off the needles because I need those needles, and I'll pull it all out and wind it back on. Seems like a waste of time, but I don't think it was. I don't think it's a waste of time. So now I need to calculate how many stitches I need for my sock, now knowing that my 6 stitches per inch. So the toe, I start with it 1.5 inches wide. So 1.5 times 6 is 9. I want an even number, so I'm going to cast on 10 stitches for my toe. So that will be 10 stitches on the front needle and 10 stitches on the back needle, a total of 20 stitches. So 1.5 inches times whatever your gauge is per needle, that's what you need for your toe. And then my target when I increase my toe is my 3 3/4 inch measurement, which twice 3 3/4 to have the circumference is 7.5, times my 6 equals 45 stitches. So I don't want 45, I want an even number. I'm going to round that down to 44 stitches, so I will have on each needle 22 stitches because I've got 2 needles. So I'll write it here in black so you can see. So I've got 22 stitches per needle is my target, equals 44 total. And my cast on, I'm going to cast on 10 stitches per needle. So that'll be a total of 20 stitches. So I'll cast on 20 stitches, 10 per needle, and then I'll increase until I've got 22 stitches per needle, 44 stitches total.